Hi, and welcome to Partner Buzz, the AWS partner-focused podcast for our business and technical leaders in our global APN community. My name's Richard Wilmot, and in addition to being your host for today, I'm a partner solution architect here in Sydney, Australia. And today I'm joined by Cajar-Robinson, Global Head of Digital Platforms at Thoughtworks, one of our premier AWS partners. Mara, great to have you with us.
Thanks, Richard. Really good to be here.
And today we're going to be taking a deep dive into modernization, what it means for our AWS partners, some best practice that can be followed, and what the opportunity is for our customers. So Mara, to kick us off, tell us a little bit about your role and what your day-to-day looks like.
My role as the head of global platforms for Thoughtworks, I really define my role as someone who integrates business and technology. So a business technologist, really. Okay. And I help organisations bridge the technical and business divide to get to business outcomes. Which
I think is really critical for all of our partners in their day-to-day, because ultimately good value comes when we drive very close alignment to business and technical. And Thoughtworks is no stranger to that. As one of our global premier AWS partners, I think our audience might not be that familiar with Thoughtworks, but you certainly carry a really deep technical and business domain expertise in every engagement you have. Yeah, that's right. Thoughtworks are a global tech consulting firm, and we've been around for 30 years, and we have really deep technical expertise, and we really couple that with strategy and design to help the organisations and our clients really succeed. Awesome. And I'm, full disclosure, I'm super lucky to be Thoughtworks' partner solution architect here in ANZ, which is great. One of the things I'd love to unpack a bit more is modernization is obviously a key theme for our partners globally. And modernization we often think about as being the technical process whereby our customers evolve their legacy architecture or their existing architectures into utilizing more modern AWS services. We often talk about serverless. We talk about maybe switching, from legacy databases to Amazon RDS for managed services. What does that look like with Thoughtworks' lens? Is it purely just a technical, or is it that business and technical approach? It's such a great question, and it's such an evolution for so many of our clients. When the modernisation is largely led by the technical team, right? Yeah. There's legacy systems and architecture that's been built over time. And of course, the more frequently you build, that becomes legacy over time. And so what we find is that where modernisation can be really successful is where there's that view of both the technology modernisation that needs to happen towards business goals. And so what does that modernisation actually look like in practical terms after that modernisation's happened? I think that certainly when we start thinking purely technically about modernisation, my personal mental model is the line of shared responsibility in the AWS shared responsibility model starts to move upwards. So AWS takes on more of that undifferentiated heavy lifting. But that's very much a technology approach. But the implications for the business from that movement upwards is really about enabling additional value to be driven to customers, isn't it? That's right. So then you can innovate faster. You can start to become more adaptive. Once you've modernized, you can actually work together more closely across business and technology and start to think about what sort of experiences do you want to deliver for your customers? What sort of benefits do you need to deliver internally, and to who? And then you can start to really be much more flexible. Which is a really interesting point, because I think with that approach, I was fortunate enough to be invited to a webinar with yourself and your Thoughtworks colleagues. And one of the things that stood out for me was the really interesting way in which Thoughtworks often speaks about migrations as a modernization journey for customers, which is a different way that we might think about it at AWS, where we think about migration and modernization being two separate phases. Unpack that for us. Why is that the case for Thoughtworks? Yeah, exactly right. And I really love this conversation, because migration, when that happens, that's such a prime opportunity to really start to modernize your business. Right. Because when you migrate, you actually have an opportunity to start thinking about what does that look like? What does the migration look like in terms of a new experience? How does that actually deliver new benefits for the organization? Not just a cost to migrate from one system to another. You actually can deliver value through that process as well. Which is interesting, because in that basis, even if we start thinking about maybe a lift and shift migration, that's totally a transformational modernization opportunity for that customer because their operational models on-prem might be totally different on cloud. And the reason why they'd move to cloud would be to unlock that additional value in agility, ability to serve customers sooner and faster. But it absolutely is a modernization, even though it might be a straight lift and shift migration, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And these conversations with clients are always really enjoyable, where we look at things purely through the technology lens and then start to really think about what does that look like in the future through the lens of the business outcomes. Yeah.
And again, those business outcomes matter because I think it's quite clear through our MAP process that our migration methodology, the MAP assess phase is a critical part of the journey for our customers because it allows us to understand how to build that business case to actually help our customers understand the value they get from moving to cloud. So I think that very much clearly is a modernization activity, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. And to think about those things in parallel rather than sequential is really helpful.
Right.
So as we're migrating, what can we modernize? And then what does that modernization journey look like through the technology stack to customer value or to how does it change operations? What do we need to do internally to really recognize what we're migrating?
Which is great because although that modernization or that migration journey, is largely technical, there's that very clear business thread that runs all the way through it because unless you focus on the objectives and that business purpose behind that migration, those modernization values, shall we say, or outcomes are super difficult to achieve, aren't they?
Yeah, that's right. And I was recently working with a client and we were doing a map assess and we were really looking at not only the migration, but what happens post the migration. What do we need to think about in parallel, and what does the modernization journey look like? Not just the migration. How do you start to dovetail those two things together?
Interesting. So very much it's about that ability to think about the why.
The why.
And I think unless we've got that why nailed down, there's a number of different technical choices that I think we could make at any stage, and trying to identify what the right part of that journey looks like for customers has to be essential. But how do we make those decisions without a clear picture of that why?
Yeah, absolutely. Because when we talk about anything from a technical standpoint, that's the how. Right. So how do we actually modernize through that technical lens? And then the why driven through the business in terms of what are the outcomes we're looking to achieve? How do we partner with the technology teams or functions to be able to realize what our strategic choices are, right? So what are the pathways to being able to create this new value through modernization, transformation, and then together you decide on the what. So you can't do it only with one side of that equation, just the pure tech function or the pure business function. You really need to come together to decide why we're doing this. What are we going to focus on first? Then how are we going to do it?
Interesting. So the tech is really just the how. I mean, not just the how. It's obviously very important and critical. We get that right. But without that why, it's very difficult to land on that what, isn't it?
That's right. Because there are strategic decisions, to your point, that you need to make within technology. Yeah. And to be able to articulate those to the business owners who really can then start to understand the impact to the outcomes. Because in today's world, you have business teams who don't necessarily understand the depth of the technology language and they're sort of lost in translation. And the technology team who don't always appreciate the outcomes and the value drivers and all the business jargon. And then so together, when you come together to be able to understand what those strategic choices are at each level, you can actually get much better outcomes.
It really comes down to that alignment, which I think is a much used word and perhaps overused in certain spheres. But certainly having that alignment across the business is critical to drive any kind of strategic outcome, really.
It really is, because when we talk about driving outcomes, we talk about what's the measurable impact. So not the qualitative, we'd like to see some form of improvement. But for the technology team to be able to show the benefits of the work and the effort and the huge effort that goes into these modernisation projects, it has to have not only the outcomes from a financial perspective, a customer perspective, operational perspective, but it also really needs that understanding of who's in the room, who am I talking to, what's important to them. So that exercise of being able to understand what that value equation looks like also gives you the opportunity to understand what is important to your other stakeholders. And then you have a really successful modernisation journey.
Which is really interesting because through that lens, it becomes really, really clear that different customers in different phases in their journey of cloud adoption will have different outcomes and value levers to pull. So thinking out, for example, how a startup would be favoring infrastructure, for example, or solutions or technologies that scale up rapidly off potentially a low cost base so they can grow and scale faster. But I should imagine that enterprises would be looking at solutions that are operationally more secure, potentially operationally easier to manage as you scale.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. Every organisation is in a different part of the journey. And I think the readiness conversation is such an important conversation because with AI and Gen AI and, these technology is always evolving. And so rather than the desire just to adopt the new technologies, to really understand the why and then the what, but actually understanding how ready are we, what are our strategic choices around the infrastructure that we need to build, or what's reversible, what are the decisions that we need to make today, which may be reversible tomorrow with little impact, but what are the decisions that we really need to stick by for the foundational growth in future? And so those discussions become really important across the organisation.
That's fascinating, and I think that the ability to drive rapid decisions, I think, we often at AWS talk about the fact that speed matters disproportionately in our business, and the ability to recognize, as we say internally, those one-way versus two-way doors allows you to move quickly. Because if you have reversible decisions, then it makes sense to think about how you proceed to deliver value to the customer faster. But then where those are one-way doors, you need admittedly a lot more certainty. So being able to identify between the two of those becomes a critical skill when you're driving modernization outcome.
Absolutely. There's a really great stat, I think it was by the university, the Copenhagen University of Technology. And they looked at all the different projects that happen all over the world and which ones are overrun and by how much. And as it turns out, the Olympics were the number one culprit. Number two was technology initiatives. And they said that 1 in 12 overrun by over 100%.
Wow.
And we know that even data initiatives today run about 500% over budget and don't deliver on their impacts. And a lot of that is around how do we actually understand what we're trying to do, not through the requirements writing and not through, the handing of the baton from business to technology, but that real partnership across the teams.
Yeah, I think that's got to be essential to make sure, again, coming back to that alignment piece. So what are some of those key lessons that you've and the larger Thoughtworks team have learnt over your period running these modernizations, and what are those common pitfalls that you've learnt to avoid, would you say, starting off?
Yeah, great question. I guess the first pitfall would be don't do the modernisation in isolation. Again, this is a business modernisation and it requires absolute tech expertise, strong engineering practices. It also requires good, strong articulation of what we're trying to achieve and why we're trying to do this thing. And so having a common language, I would say, is really critically important with that. We talk about business capability mapping and how it takes you away from prioritising use cases into being able to see the organisation through the capability, the systems that are associated with that, the strategy that needs to be built in order to mature capabilities. And so together that's one piece that we really see driving successful change. And
I think underpinning that successful change is really the ability to innovate, because I think without that ability to innovate, organisations might potentially be in a position where they're less competitive than they'd like to be as well.
Yeah, absolutely. The ability to innovate is just, I feel like in today's world, that's such a critical component for everyone always. And being able to understand what the benefits are of that innovation, what the costs are of delivering that benefit is really important. Also, when we're thinking about these new innovations, rather than delivering them and then later on, sometimes these innovations can actually increase the cost of the technology team, right? And so when we're thinking about AI or like actually APIs or any of those technical how we might modernize, that can actually increase the cost of a business. And what you don't want to happen at the end is that suddenly the business team have this great innovation, they've taken it to market, but the technologies team's costs have increased disproportionately. And so collectively being able to paint that picture so that it's collective success is really critical.
which I think is quite clear. We often hear from our customers that instead of chasing cost reduction, we're actually looking at value creation.
That's right.
CFOs that I've worked with in the past are happy if their costs increase as long as their value increases faster.
That's right.
What they're achieving.
And being able to tell that story in a way that's understood in exactly the same way from the CEO through to any junior person who's just entered the organisation is really vital. And that's where really where we see success and how we try and bring our technical teams and business teams together to be able to modernise in that way.
You were giving me a very interesting tell me a very interesting experience that you had when you were helping one of our AWS partners, one of our AWS customers, with a map assessment phase, where you mentioned that you were one of the only business-focused people in the room, and you found that was potentially a missed opportunity. Unpack that for us a bit.
Yeah, that was a great experience, actually. And I feel definitely very privileged that I get to sort of, have my experience from industry and then really see this play out and be able to kind of navigate this really quickly for the client while we're there. It was just a very quick engagement. And they were really tech teams from Thoughtworks, engineers, really incredible engineers from the client. And it was the business decisions were, it's okay, they can wait till later.
Right.
And you talked about it earlier, the migration, like just migrating is one part. If we could think about the total transformation and modernization that could happen in parallel, we're able to do that through that journey, just in the quick week and a half, being able to pivot to here's some additional value that we can deliver in the migration phase. And here's how you can drive our modernization and transformation through this journey.
So again, it really comes down to, like so many things, having the right people in the room, doesn't it?
It does. It really does. And having an appreciation for why the others are required in the room, rather than, no, this is a tech project. Yeah. And I really try to, in all the engagements, explain that technology, but it's tech-led business transformation. And in today's world, where technology is the core of every business, and not everyone understands technology as well as the engineers do, we each have a part to play in being able to educate each other and make sure that we come together with an open mind and really sort of be imaginative and try and speak each other's language.
Which I think is really essential, because some of the feedback I've heard from partners I've been fortunate enough to work with, often there's almost a hesitancy from some of them, where if they're working with a given stakeholder within a customer, they feel that delineates their scope of work. Sorry, not the actual scope of work as a document, but the scope of which they can address a problem is purely within that particular technical scope. And they often feel fairly frustrated because they don't feel empowered to go beyond that, to think about how they can add more value to the business as a whole. Is that something you've experienced as well?
Oh, absolutely. And it's such a good insight, because often the remit is deliver this thing. And we don't need to go on either side of the boundaries. We don't need to go into and speak to other parts of the organisation, because our role is this. But I would say that everyone's accountable for understanding how to deliver that impact. Right? So that change that you've been asked to deliver, sometimes it's not framed in exactly the same way, that it's not a passing of the baton. It's like an understanding of who can actually help make some of those strategic technical decisions, and how can you actually elevate technology within an organisation to make sure that everyone shares in that incredible success.
And for our partners especially, that becomes absolutely critical if you're speaking to the right stakeholders within a customer business to drive the outcomes, to really be truly customer obsessed for them. You need to think about how you can go beyond to understand how the stakeholder you're working with interacts with other stakeholders of the business to drive even more value. Because ultimately that's what you're trying to achieve, driving significant value to the customer as a whole. Absolutely.
If we think about modernization through APIs, as an example, we might have an API gateway, and the gateway on its own could be one scope of work, but it sits within an API first strategy that has many other building blocks associated. And so an understanding of the contribution of the gateway to the API first strategy is really important, and the interplay between different project teams now as well as a broader organisation. And why we want an API first strategy is maybe to build an ecosystem, maybe to modernize, maybe to create microservices, but to be able to thread that through and then be able to talk about what the API first strategy will deliver over which milestones becomes really powerful.
Which is fascinating. I think certainly from our conversations, API first strategies could mean multiple things to different parts of the business. Yeah. Unless you've got a very clear understanding of why an API strategy makes sense for the business as a whole, it becomes extremely difficult to execute on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Sometimes we might see teams that have defined their one pillar as an API first strategy, and trying to really unpack that across all the different functions within the organisation can just take a minute to reset and all see things through the same perspective.
It certainly seems like a good idea to think about a tool to modernize is an API first strategy, because that allows you to delineate business functions across a well-defined boundary. But I think, like, even as a software developer myself in the past, just because you've defined an API, you need to have an understanding of what goes on behind it as well in order to use that API correctly and properly. So it's not an impermeable line. There's actually got to be communication across that with that transaction across an API.
Great. And I love this conversation, because then the business need to understand that from the technical point of view, from the engineers, to really be able to start to unpack, why is that important to you, and how does that change what I might be able to do tomorrow, or how does that change the experience for the consumer, or how does that change the cost associated with building with this pathway versus another option. And that conversation is always fabulous.
Which comes circling straight back to shared value, which I think you and I have spoken about at length, and how that importance of that shared value is how you execute on the strategy. Yeah,
absolutely. And sometimes, strategy can change far faster than the speed at which you can build something. And so having that shared value and a clear, connected understanding of what the strategy is across maybe multiple pillars, that can often take 5 years to deliver that strategy in itself, but really being able to get together, have a clear understanding of what that strategy is. And then for technology to be able to contribute new ways to modernize or transform, or tech-led decisions around which technology you might be able to adopt in order to get this outcome, rather than a directive around, here's the scope, this is what we want to build.
I think for me, what resonates really clearly, and this is something which you raised a few weeks ago when we were speaking, is how customers' needs change significantly faster than we potentially can catch up to.
Yes.
And unless we've actually built the mechanisms around how we operate our business and the technologies we use to run our businesses, it's difficult to get out ahead of our customers to actually make good decisions on their behalf, so that we aren't always playing catch up. If we can identify what are the key mechanisms we can put into our business, such as shared value, to enable us to pivot rapidly, it becomes significantly more complex to actually chase customer demand. And really looking around corners is what I suppose you do every day, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And what I've done my entire career, I started in the fashion industry, and I spent 20 years there having to forecast what those trends might be before they were even, on the runway in store, and with timelines, with supply chains being far longer than the 7-week cycles of a fashion cycle. So the ability to understand where you are in the life cycle. There are different metrics with, when you're experimenting and when you're looking at what might be successful. How do I trust this choice over another choice, because there's a huge cost or profitability associated with getting that thing wrong before you put it into production. So that can be any sort of production across any sort of industry.
And that's hugely transferable, because I think if we just take the parallel in engineering, where you need to have the operational capability to pivot fast, built into how you operate your business, because your engineering lead time, much as production lead time in fashion, there are certain time frames. It takes a certain amount of time to do a thing. You can't shorten it beyond a lower limit. We know that as engineers, you can't accelerate beyond a certain point. You've got to think about other ways in which you structure your business, and shared value is clearly a way to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talk about building confidence in those early stages. And how do you do that in dual track or multi-track when you're actually building the experience or modernizing part of the system that you are confident will deliver the outcomes? And then where are you exploring, and what does that proof of value look like? How are you articulating that as a collective team to then what are you sensing in the market, and how can that actually transform or modernize your business and create entirely new, innovative opportunities? Everyone has a role to play in that.
Yeah. So how do you get started on that journey? How do you as a customer embark on that modernization journey? What are some of the key things you need to have in place? We speak about shared value. How do you get to a point where you've actually got some shared value across your teams?
Oh, what a great question.
Very much a can of worms question, I'm sure. But
I like it. It's what I'm super passionate about. And the articulation of value or outcomes. I think starting there's often boards have ratios that they measure in terms of what a good ratio looks like, what success looks like, or they've got a balanced scorecard. Taking those outcomes and really thinking about what drives that performance. How do we look at that collectively across business and technology and understand what are the outcomes we're looking for, what are the drivers of that performance, and then how can we fundamentally make that change? I think that first framework is really critical to develop as a team, because then you start to understand each other's perspectives as well as what drives the needle on a change.
Yeah. So it sounds suspiciously like working backwards from the customers we talk about at length at AWS, where unless you understand what that key driver that sits behind that goal that the board has set, for example, and understand how each one of those teams play into that and then almost play it back to them so they can see it. Do you find that often teams are focused very heavily on that KPI and sometimes they don't see the larger context?
It's really interesting. The assumption is they would be, right? Because suddenly we have these fixed outcomes or levers or drivers of that performance, and that people become fixated on that. But when you understand what drives that performance and you've got some leading indicators, or you've got some offense, defense type metrics, then you can actually start to really have a much better conversation between teams, between individuals around what could possibly move the needle on that to get the outcome. The outcome's not just financial. Right? I think that's just one sort of aspect, the financial aspect, but the customer success and the customer satisfaction elements, operational value from the ecosystem, risk as one view in terms of what that outcome and the impact is. It's not just purely through just the financial aspect, which I think is important.
So financial is just one aspect. I think you touched on risk, and this is something which we are very mindful and aware of in our customer workloads, for example. And I find it's often helpful to think about that customers have got a risk budget.
Yes.
We'd rather they didn't spend it on technology, so we'd rather work with them to identify areas where they can remove risk from their technology estate on AWS, so they can then think about deploying commercial risk elsewhere where it actually makes sense.
Exactly, and doing that at the same time that you're thinking about any transformation, right? Like thinking about that at the core, or other organisations that might be thinking about policy and risk around policy at the core. It's really thinking about those things, not just outcomes in tandem, with how might we build this thing, but all these critical components today, which become, far more important today than they've ever been.
And drawing that line for the individual KPIs that actually feed up to those goals becomes critical, because I think teams can rightly focus on those key performance indicators to make sure they are doing the right thing. But unless you can kind of play it back to help teams understand how that fits into the whole, it becomes very difficult to drive that shared strategy. Because it might not necessarily be clear to teams on how their technology is used. I know from my experience in the past where the first time I went as a very, very, very junior engineer to a customer site and understood exactly how the software I was building was being used, I found that was really powerful because that actually helped me shape the decisions that I made technically down the track.
So that's so great. It's just so true. I just thinking back to some of my past experiences, and often we talk about wanting to achieve efficiency gains. And so what drives efficiency versus what might drive growth? But actually then I say, well, if I'm driving efficiency internally, how can I actually also think about that in a way which can unlock new value to the customer? Because you can have a cost saving internally through becoming more efficient, but if you can translate that into how does that actually change the experience for the end consumer of what it is that you're becoming more efficient at, that's where you suddenly start to be able to link efficiency and growth together, not just cost reduction.
This is awesome. I think very often I've heard you speak about the importance of focusing on the experience, not just the service delivered.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just very much to that point, like what is the end goal? Like, what are we actually trying to achieve? And the experience is so critical. Not all experiences are equally valuable. You might have heard me say that as well, is that like the experience is important, but understanding which experiences are the most impactful and really focusing there.
Again, that becomes super important. Again, it's that outcome you're trying to achieve, which is a really great point. When you start thinking about it, if we're driving efficiency and we're not necessarily doing the right thing, we're just doing the wrong thing at a lower price point, but we're not necessarily driving better value for the customer. So I think from what I've heard, it certainly sounds like by being mindful about those objectives we're trying to drive, making those good decisions to make sure we aren't just doing the wrong thing in a better way, we're actually doing something which potentially is thinking outside the box.
Perfect.
To drive outcomes.
Yeah. Absolutely right.
So ultimately, working backwards makes a ton of sense. Then understanding that we've got very clearly defined ROI, I think, has to be critical too. So we understand that we're actually getting value for that investment. And then also you mentioned previously there can sometimes be a bit of a dichotomy between investment and experimentation. How does that play into the modernization debate?
That's such a good question. The proof of value. So experimentation is so vital in order to be able to understand how confident are we at experimentation stage to be able to take this into into production, to be able to modernize or transform. Those aspects across teams. So not just technology. I was having this conversation with someone internally at Thoughtworks from the data science team. And we're talking about what's the difference between experimentation within a data team versus experimentation across teams. And we decided it was actually largely the same. The thing that we're measuring for the, I guess, progress towards what good looks like is still a signal. It's not the final impact. And so understanding what those like what you're sensing, what those leading indicators, what might actually move the needle to achieve the outcomes. Yeah, I think that's...
Which then becomes a data point that you can actually go and get investment for. Because as you said, experimentation drives that proof of value, which then is a necessary part of driving that investment flywheel as well. Because otherwise, how do you know making the right decision? So it kind of comes back to that one-way versus two-way door thing, doesn't it? Experimentation is that two-way door.
It really is. Yeah. And I really like to believe that gone are the days that we can just build a business case without any sort of experimentation, just desktop research, which tells us what the addressable market is, and then, cross our fingers and hope for the best that we can go and build and deliver, and they will come. I think there has been a lot of lessons learnt globally, which shows you do need to experiment. You need data. You need to understand what people's beliefs are as a result of that data. The one thing I would say is that the data points are very rational. You still need to understand the human side of, why would someone believe that that's true versus not? And so that joint experimentation is really critical.
Which gets fairly messy when you're trying to work with, engineers like myself, where we tend to view the world in a very binary way, but trying to bring that that qualitative nuance to bear requires different types of data too, doesn't it?
It really does, and I guess there's a reason why some really obvious investments don't get funded is because everyone has a slightly different belief system.
Yeah. And it's about getting to that level of confidence no matter what the belief system of those investors needs to be and look like so you can move forward.
That's right. And the confidence doesn't mean certainty is, I think, just the other really critical piece is like, because we have experimented and we believe that it's going to move the needle by this magnitude, you'd hope that you've got enough confidence that that investment drives that outcome. So that's where you want to get to. But there's no certainty because anything can happen outside of the control within the environment at any point in time. Yeah.
So I suppose where we're fortunate in technology is if we're focusing on things like going back to that map assess phase where we start building business cases around the TCO of a migration to AWS. That provides a degree of certainty at an infrastructure level, which we can then say, great, we aren't necessarily exposing ourselves to uncertainty through that migration process.
Yes.
We can actually afford to take commercial risk elsewhere in the business.
Exactly.
Which I think makes a ton of sense. Which is really interesting because I think that very often modernization is viewed, or technical modernization is viewed as something that might not necessarily need the same rigor around that business case. But from what you've said, it sounds like it's absolutely critical if we approach a technical modernization with much the same rigor as we would a migration, because essentially it's very similar. It's driving the same outcome at a different stage in the customer journey.
Oh, it is. And I think back to my early career, well before Thoughtworks, where modernization, there would be an incredible amount of lost investment because we didn't take this sort of collective view and this incremental approach. It was all looked at through exactly the same one big monolithic, we're modernizing every element of this. And the waste associated with that process is extraordinary. And that's part of the thing that I love most about my job is working with, incredible engineers who really understand how to do this well, and then collectively be able to talk about why do we need to focus on this section, and then how do we actually do this properly.
Yeah, I think very often we can fall into the pitfalls of the perfect becoming the enemy of the good.
Yes.
To drive forward. If you can think about modernization, from the webinar that we were previously on, you spoke eloquently about modernization being a journey. And I think if you're trying to modernize everything at once, it becomes a very difficult task because technical evolution is inevitable. It'll always be happening. You'll always be looking at some legacy in your application estate and figuring out how you can evolve that over time to bring change into the process.
Perfect. And this is where it all comes together so beautifully, right? Everything we've just talked about it's a journey. It will continue. Technology will evolve. You will always want to change things. But having the tools the tools within engineering to be able to do these things fast and quickly, the tools to be able to create a common language across business and technology, to be able to really understand what parts we should prioritize and modernize, then suddenly you become much more adaptive as an organization, and you can move funds to the right areas and think about the outcomes that need to be delivered in which sequence of modernisation. So not prioritisation, but the sequence of the modernisation journey rather than what's of a higher priority.
Because if you had to wait to get everything right, it's probably not going to end in the way you expect.
Totally. I mean, that's where we see the projects that run well over budget, well over time, don't deliver the impacts because the path to that successful modernisation has sort of fallen
And it's
somewhere.
not just purely a technology path, it needs to be all-encompassing.
It does.
That's fascinating. So in some respects, it's not so much change management, it's actually having good operational change acceleration through the shared value framework.
I love it. Yes, exactly.
Oh, that's a great way of thinking about it. As we round out our conversation, Maura, what do we say would be the top three things which you'd encourage our AWS partners to think about as they embark on modernization or migration journeys with customers?
The first one, as we've talked all the way through this, is understanding what outcomes look like. Being able to have a scorecard or some form of what are the drivers of performance, what are the levers of those drivers, and what are the signals that we're going to start to achieve that. So then you can actually start to think about experimentation and then moving into proof of value and then into delivery into the outcome, and then being able to tell that really successful story as a collective team and then that education starts to infuse through organizations and you can become more adaptive and really grow much more quickly. So outcomes would be one.
Yeah.
Second one would be readiness.
Okay.
Just really considering we have this ambition to invest in any emerging technology. Are we really ready to deliver that?
Yeah.
Like what does that cloud infrastructure look like? What do we need to be able to enable that journey? So readiness, I would say, would be the second one. And the third one would be don't wait to account for the cost of the benefits until after it was delivered. Make sure that is being considered all the way through, because then the more successful your early modernisation journeys are through this sort of path, the more investment you'll get, because the more confidence you'll, that instill within the organisation, and you'll just be able to unlock more revenue, more investment for
So it's almost like identify where you've got the flywheel and what the inputs are to drive it. And I think, as you said, if you can get those early wins through things like proof of value, it unlocks and demonstrates that investment can actually drive great returns. So being able to have the right proofs of value are going to be essential to that, from what you said.
Absolutely. And proof of value over proof of concept. What can we deliver that is scalable? So first is scalability through proof of value rather than what's a POC that might not be able to go into production so easily or might not be scalable so quickly and easily.
To actually get that value. Mara, we're just about out of time, but thank you so much. That's been a really fascinating discussion. Really appreciate that.
Thanks for chatting, Richard.
And from me, thank you very much for joining us for another episode of Partner Buzz. Do please make sure that you subscribe so you never miss an episode. And thank you very much. See you next time.